I opened the bathroom door without knocking because I thought Greg was still out back checking the kayak ropes like he said he would, and I didn't hear the shower or see any steam leaking from under the frame, so I figured the room was empty. Just long enough for me to grab a fresh towel from the shelf near the sink before heading down to the dock. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the thick heat hit my face, and before I could stop myself or close the door, I saw him. He was standing near the mirror, bare-chested, skin still damp, the white towel sitting low around his hips, one hand resting on the sink like he had every right to be there. And maybe he did, technically, but that didn't make it any less jarring to see him like that, calm and unbothered, looking directly at me as if I were the one who had crossed some invisible line. I froze, one foot on tile and one still on wood, my hand clutching the doorknob. Behind me, and for a second too long, we just stood there, facing each other, neither of us saying a word. He didn't cover himself or turn away. He didn't smirk or look embarrassed. He just watched me with that same quiet steadiness he'd had the night before when he stepped off the boat and introduced himself like we were meeting at a family reunion instead of on the edge of a private lagoon. Jacob. 23, Greg's grandson from his first marriage, the one I'd only seen once years ago when he was still growing into his frame and speaking in half sentences. Now he was a different kind of presence, quieter but heavier, like he was still deciding how much space to take up in the room. I finally looked away, mumbled something that didn't sound like words, and pulled the door shut behind me, my fingers hot against the brass. By the time I got to the kitchen, I'd already replayed the moment 5 times, each one slower than the last, trying to decide if I'd imagined how still he stood, how direct his eyes were, or how mine hadn't moved away, as fast as they should have. I poured myself a glass of water I didn't want and leaned against the counter, counting the droplets on the outside of the glass as if they might settle something in me. We'd only arrived the night before. Greg had booked the trip as a quiet anniversary gift, a way to reset after a long year full of missed dinners, late work calls, and more silence than we'd ever acknowledged out loud. The villa was remote, beautiful, built of weathered wood with big open windows and a deck that wrapped all the way around, looking out over the blue-green shallows of the lagoon. I was still unpacking when he mentioned Jacob. "He'll be joining us tomorrow," Greg said, like it was nothing. Like I wouldn't mind an unexpected guest in a house with 2 bedrooms and nowhere to hide. Just for a few days. He's had a rough patch. Needs air and space and someone who knows how to breathe. I didn't ask for details. I nodded, folded a blouse, and told myself it wouldn't be a big deal. But that was before I opened that door. At dinner, the 3 of us sat, outside on the deck. Greg grilled something simple and poured wine like we hadn't been on autopilot for the past 3 months. The air was soft, the breeze steady, and the sky fading into that lavender stretch of time when you forget what hour it is. I listened, to the sound of their voices more than the words. Jacob didn't talk much. When he did, it was quiet and polite, the kind of speech that didn't demand anything but made you lean in a little. At one point, Greg was telling a story about an old friend who got lost on a hiking trail in Arizona, and Jacob laughed, really laughed, and I looked up. He was already looking at me, not staring, just watching, just waiting. I looked down at my plate. Later, Greg excused himself to take a call inside. Jacob and I sat in the yellow glow of the terrace lights, the empty plates between us, the soft clinking of cutlery we hadn't put away. "You're lucky," Jacob said, not looking at me. "This place is quiet in a good way. Some places are just empty. This one's full of something." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing. He stood up, stretched slightly, and walked down the steps toward the dock. I watched the shadows swallow him piece by piece until there was nothing but the soft sound of water and one folded napkin still on his plate. The next morning, Greg was already in cargo shorts and sunglasses by the time I finished tying back. My hair standing in the open kitchen doorway with his phone pressed to one ear and his travel bag sitting just behind him on the floor, like he had packed it quietly before sunrise and waited to tell me until after the coffee was already brewing. He said there was an urgent development with one of the construction contracts back in Panama City. Something about site permits and a shipment of faulty steel beams that needed personal supervision before the whole thing unraveled. And though I nodded along while he explained the timeline, my eyes kept drifting to the bag near his feet, the one that confirmed this wasn't just a few hours at a nearby office. He said it wouldn't take long, maybe 3 days at most, and he kissed me on the cheek without looking directly into my eyes, murmuring something about trusting us to manage without him for a while, his tone casual but not quite light, as if the idea had been settled long before I even stepped off the plane. Once he was gone, the house felt too quiet in the wrong places. The floorboards didn't creak the same. The ceiling fan hummed just a little too loud, and even the sound of the lagoon brushing against the dock like soft breath felt distant, like it had taken a step back. Jacob moved through the house with a kind of unhurried rhythm, not lazy exactly, but measured in a way that suggested he wasn't in a rush to be anywhere else. He didn't knock on doors. He didn't ask what the plan was. He simply appeared, on the deck with a mug of coffee just as I stepped outside to water the potted basil, or near the back steps with a folded towel when I went to hang our swimsuits to dry, or walking barefoot through the kitchen while I rinsed dishes, his silence never awkward, only present. I kept my tone even and my questions neutral. He matched that energy effortlessly, answering with short replies that carried weight without sounding clipped, his voice always steady, his expression unreadable in a way that made me feel like I was missing a layer of conversation. On the second evening, after the air had cooled and the sky above the mangroves began to shift into its usual palette of dusky pink and soft indigo, I decided to do the laundry that had started to pile up in the basket near the bedroom, more out of restlessness than necessity. The washer on the villa's back porch was old but reliable, and I clipped the damp clothes one by one along the line Greg had strung up between two poles just past the stairs. I wore a pair of linen shorts and one of Greg's faded t-shirts, the sleeves rolled up to my elbows and my feet bare against the warm planks of the deck. The sun hadn't quite disappeared yet, but it was sinking low and the light came at me from the side, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the railing. Jacob came outside holding a mug, the ceramic chipped near the handle, and stood, a few feet away, watching the horizon. I didn't say anything at first. I was focused on pinning a shirt without letting the breeze knock the other pieces into each other, but I knew he was there. Not because he made noise, but because the silence changed shape around him. "You're very calm," he said suddenly, not turning to look at me. "People think that's easy to fake, but it isn't. You either are or you aren't." I didn't answer right away. I reached for another towel, smoothing it flat before folding it in half along the line. "That's an unusual thing to say," I finally offered, keeping my eyes on the cloth between my fingers. He took a sip from the mug, then set it on the railing without looking down. "Most people feel quiet with something. Noise, words, movement. You don't. It's rare." I could have dismissed it. I could have laughed or changed the subject or stepped back into the house like it hadn't landed the way it did. But I stood there for a moment longer, fingers resting against the wooden clothespin, the wind pulling lightly at the hem of my shirt. He didn't move closer. He didn't explain himself, but I felt it anyway. The shift, the small tilt in the gravity of the space between us. Not invasive, just aware. I finished with the line, brushing my hands against my thighs out of habit, and walked back inside, without another word, leaving the door open behind me just wide enough to let the evening light spill across the kitchen floor, like something I hadn't meant to invite in. On the third morning, I pulled on my sneakers and tied them tighter than necessary, telling myself it was just for the sake of circulation, even though I knew it was more about routine than fitness, because I hadn't run since we landed, and something about the weight in my chest needed movement. Something steady and repetitive, like breath hitting air in rhythm with steps pressing into sand. The beach was soft where the tide had pulled back, the edges still glistening with morning light, and I let my feet find the firm parts of the shore without thinking too hard about direction until I saw him up ahead, not moving, just crouched near the edge of a flat rock with his phone pointed downward, like he was filming something quiet and alive. He looked up before I reached him and smiled without getting up, the same half-smile he wore when he poured wine the other night and asked if I wanted the last piece of bread. And he said he was watching the crabs move across the reef because their patterns were interesting to film up close, not for any reason except they were honest in how they moved. I slowed down but didn't stop right away. The kind of moment where you don't want to disturb what's already settled. But he stood eventually and brushed sand from his knees and asked if I wanted to see the footage, holding out the phone without forcing it into my hands. The video showed slow arcs of movement under clear water, the shell shifting sideways with its tiny legs working beneath like gears. And I nodded, even though I couldn't tell what I was supposed to be seeing beyond how patient he had been in watching it long enough to notice. We walked slowly back along the beach path that curled between mangroves and low palms, not speaking, for a while until he asked what kind of music I used to play in the car when I drove alone, and I laughed without meaning to, and told him I hadn't been alone in a car for longer than I could remember. He said his was usually quiet unless he needed something to fill the silence. And then it was always either Coltrane or Chet Baker because they didn't rush through anything, and the space between the notes felt more honest than the melody. I told him I understood that more than I wanted to admit, and he looked at me not with surprise, but with something like relief, like finding out we were in on the same secret. When we reached the edge of the villa steps, he turned slightly and said, I had a beautiful voice. Not the way people say it after you sing or answer a call, but like the sound of it had been sitting with him for a while, and he'd only just now decided to name it. I didn't answer right away. Didn't even look at him as I stepped barefoot onto the porch, letting the wood creak under me like something familiar. But the compliment stayed with me longer than the silence that followed. Later that day, I reached for one of my lighter dresses without checking the weather and chose a blouse I hadn't worn in years, something soft and open near the shoulders that usually made me self-conscious, but this time felt like the right thing for the heat, or so I told myself as I smoothed it down over my hips. He didn't comment when he saw me in it, didn't glance too long or let his expression shift, but I noticed his posture changed slightly when I entered the room, the way he sat straighter, or maybe just more still. That night he came out onto the terrace carrying a bottle of wine he said he found in the kitchen drawer under the paper towels, and though I knew exactly where that bottle had been since we arrived, I didn't correct him because something about the way he said it made me want to believe he'd discovered it himself. We sat across from each other in the low outdoor chairs where the cushions still smelled faintly of sea salt, and I played music from my phone without really curating it, letting the songs shuffle through things I hadn't listened to in years, and he nodded along like he already knew them even when I was sure he didn't. He asked if I'd ever seen Coltrane live, and I said no, that by the time I was old enough to want it, the chance was already gone, and he didn't say anything after. That just poured more wine into my glass and tilted his head back to look at the stars like they were holding something steady above us. He asked if I ever sat outside alone at night just to listen without thinking, and I said I used to when we first moved into our old house before the neighborhood filled with traffic and sprinklers and voices that always felt louder after dark, and I said it quietly without expecting it to matter. But he didn't respond right away, and just kept looking at the sky like there was something up there worth waiting for. The music was still playing, and I don't remember which song came on. When he got up and walked over to the chair behind mine where the folded blanket had been left untouched since the first night, and though the air wasn't cold, he picked it up and paused for a second as if deciding what to do next, before stepping behind me and gently draping it across my shoulders. Like it wasn't something deliberate, but simply something that needed to be done. His fingers brushed the side of my neck as he adjusted the edge, and even though the touch lasted only a second, it sent something sharp and hot down my spine like an unexpected pulse waking up in a part of me I thought had long gone. Quiet. And I sat still under the weight of it, not because I was frozen, but because I didn't want to interrupt it or misread it or admit how much I felt it. He said nothing and returned to his seat and sipped his wine like nothing had happened. And I stayed where I was with the blanket holding on to more than just the air and my glass warm in my hand. Though I hadn't taken a sip in several minutes and wasn't sure I remembered how it tasted. When I went back inside, I didn't fold the blanket or place it back where it had come from. I let it fall across the arm of the couch like it belonged there. Not as a gesture, but because I couldn't bring myself to turn it into just fabric again. I cleaned the kitchen without needing to, wiping surfaces that were already clean, checking the contents of the fridge even though we weren't out of anything. And when I opened the drawer near the window to put away the corkscrew, I saw a small black notebook tucked beneath the stack of menus and resort pamphlets. The kind of notebook people carry when they don't trust their phones to hold something fully. I hesitated only a moment before pulling it out, not because I was curious in a careless way, but because I felt the weight of it before I even touched the cover. And when I opened it near the center, I found only one line written in neat, precise handwriting that seemed too careful to be rushed. Her breath moves like the tide. I stood there reading it again and again with the drawer still half open and the bay light from the stove painting the page in dull gold, and I didn't know if it was about me or about someone else, or maybe just a thought he had while sitting on the dock alone. But something in it settled deep inside me like recognition, even if it wasn't meant for me. I closed the notebook slowly and placed it exactly where I found it, and shut the drawer with steady hands and turned off the kitchen light, like I was trying not to wake whatever had been written there that night. I lay in bed with the sheet pulled to my chin and the fan spinning above me in its slow, uneven rhythm, and I stared at the ceiling for longer than I want to admit, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body refused to let go of how close he had stood and how quiet it had all felt. At some point, I walked barefoot to the window and looked out toward the lagoon where the chairs still sat angled toward each other with just enough space between them to hold everything we hadn't said. And even in the dark, I could feel the outline of that moment stretched thin between the water and the air. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was awake. Not from sound or movement, but from something in the night that felt unfinished. Something just beneath the surface of what we had allowed ourselves to acknowledge. I closed the window carefully and went back to bed and pulled the sheet over my shoulder and lay still with my eyes open. Not afraid and not waiting, just listening to the quiet that no longer felt like mine alone. And when I finally drifted into something that resembled rest, it wasn't sleep exactly, but something slower. Something that hummed under my skin, like warmth trying not to burn. When he asked if I wanted to go, I hesitated longer than I needed to, not because I didn't understand what kind of night it was or what kind of party it might turn into, but because part of me had already said yes before. My mouth ever opened, and when I finally nodded and said, just for an hour, I pretended like I was doing it to be polite. Even though we both knew I was curious in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. He said there was a beach gathering near the southern end of the island where the palms opened into a wide cove and someone from the resort staff was setting up string lights between the trees while a local DJ played vinyl mixes from a low wooden booth in the sand. And the sound would carry out over the water if the wind stayed soft like this. And the air smelled of citrus and something darker. Something floral and slightly burned, like rum in a metal cup. I stood in the bedroom for 15 minutes pretending to look through the clothes I had packed without really seeing them, touching fabric without thinking about weight or style or shape, until my fingers landed on the dress I had brought more out of instinct than intention. A pale gray slip with a low back and thin shoulder ties, made of something barely heavier than air, and when I held it up against my body in the mirror, I didn't recognize the person looking back. Not completely. Not with her hair unpinned and her collarbone exposed in a way I hadn't allowed since the summer Greg and I went to New Orleans before his second back surgery. I didn't wear heels or sandals, just the same flat shoes I always kept by the front door, and when I stepped out into the dark, he was already waiting with 2 drinks in his hands, something cold and citrusy in plastic cups with slices of fruit clinging to the rim, and he didn't say anything about the dress, but the pause in his posture was enough. We walked along the path behind the villa until the sound reached us, a low pulse of music wrapped in laughter and clinking bottles. And as we stepped onto the sand, I saw the party had already spread across the beach like a tide. People in light, clothing dancing in uneven groups beneath the glow of strung bulbs, some swaying, some spinning, some just standing in circles with their feet half buried and their faces caught between joy and something gentler, something like memory. At first I stayed near the edge, holding my drink carefully with both hands, watching the flicker of flames from the bonfire that sent sparks climbing into the canopy like fireflies trying to find their way out. And I felt out of place in the way a person does when their body is older than the rhythm, but their spirit still remembers how to move. Jacob didn't leave my side, but he didn't crowd me either, didn't talk unless I started the sentence, didn't ask me to dance or pull me into the center of it all, and somehow that made his presence louder than if he had. Someone handed me a second drink without asking what I wanted, and I took it because the ice was melting and my hands felt empty without something cold to hold. And when the music shifted into something slower and less structured, I let myself close my eyes for a second and feel the beat as if it were inside my chest instead of out in the sand. He leaned in close enough for his voice to reach my ear without raising it and asked if I wanted to see the moon reflected in the water. And I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was so obviously an excuse to walk away from the noise. And I said yes, even though I didn't look at him when I answered. We stepped past the edge of the firelight and moved down, toward the far curve of the lagoon where the water stretched wide and still and the shore bent into a quiet crescent, with only the soft lapping of waves and the hum of insects to break the silence. He didn't speak again until we stopped and the moonlight hit the surface in a long, unbroken ribbon that shimmered with every movement of the tide. And he said it reminded him of a song he couldn't name, something about how some beauty only works if you don't try to hold it too long. I turned toward him just slightly, not fully, but enough to see his expression in the half-light, and I felt the breeze lift the hem of my dress in a way that reminded me I hadn't worn anything this light in years. And then he looked at me like he was trying to memorize something that hadn't happened yet. And then he kissed me. He kissed me like he wasn't afraid of the silence that might come afterward. Like whatever I would do next wouldn't change the fact that he had already decided to feel something in that moment. And for the first few seconds, I didn't pull away. Not because I wanted it in the way a girl might want to be claimed or taken, but because there was something terrifying and quiet and strangely kind in the way his mouth met mine, like the kiss itself wasn't a question or a challenge, but a statement of fact that had waited too long to be said out loud. His hand didn't move to my waist and his body didn't press forward, and there was no urgency in the way he leaned in. Only a stillness so heavy I could hear the sound of the tide brushing against the sand behind us, and the sharp rhythm of my own breath trying to make sense of how quickly the air had changed. And as my eyes closed without meaning to, and the corners of his lips softened against mine, I felt something inside me give way, not collapse, just loosen, like a knot I hadn't realized I'd been tightening for years. The wind lifted the edge of my dress, and the salt in the air made the kiss feel deeper than it was. And for a moment, I forgot who I was supposed to be, and let myself taste the sweetness, just beneath the heat. But then my body caught up with my mind, and I pulled away sharply like someone who had touched something hot by accident and wasn't sure how bad the burn would be until it settled under the skin. Took 2 quick steps back without thinking, My hand raised not as a warning, but like I needed something physical between us. And the sound of the music drifting from the fire reminded me how far we had stepped from the part of the night where nothing had happened yet. Stared at him with something between anger and disbelief, and the edge of embarrassment that always comes when you realize you let someone see something too real too soon, and he didn't speak, didn't apologize or explain, just stood there, with his arms at his sides and that same calm in his eyes that I hated because it made me feel like I was the only one falling. I told him not to say anything about what had just happened, not to mention it, not to let it out into the world like it was something we could joke about later or bury under other memories. And I told him especially not to let his grandfather know, not because I thought Greg would be cruel or angry, but because some things break people in quiet ways they never admit, and I didn't want to be the reason Greg looked at me like a stranger after all these years. Jacob didn't argue, and didn't move, and didn't offer a promise, and I didn't wait for one. I just turned and walked back toward the villa with my sandals in one hand, and the sand cooling fast beneath my feet, as if the ground itself had changed since we left the firelight. The path back felt longer than it had earlier that night, every shadow along the trees reminding me how little light it takes for something to look like danger when your chest is full of noise. And when I reached the house, I didn't go to the kitchen or pour a glass of water or check the windows like I usually did. I walked straight to the bathroom and locked the door behind me with a force that felt more like a plea than protection. Turned on the shower without waiting for the water to warm and stepped in before I had taken off everything I was wearing, because the heat under my skin had already made the fabric feel heavy and wrong and unfamiliar, and as the water soaked through the thin dress and turned it translucent against my body, I leaned both hands against the wall and let my forehead rest between my arms, like I was trying to push a thought out of my head with the weight of my own bones. I stayed there longer than necessary, long after the water lost its heat and started to chill, long after the dress clung to me like regret, long after the silence of the house had returned to its full stillness, and I let it all run over, me with the same rhythm as the tide I had heard only minutes ago. The kiss still pressed somewhere deep beneath my ribs where I didn't know how to reach it and didn't want to. I knew I would remember how the moonlight hit the side of his face and how he didn't flinch when I pulled away and how he looked at me like he was waiting for me to forgive both of us. And I knew that forgiveness would come whether I wanted it or not, slow and steady and sharp. And I hated that part most of all. The next morning he acted like nothing had happened, like there hadn't been a kiss under the moonlight or the sound of the tide catching its breath while my heart stumbled through something it had no name for. And he moved through the kitchen with a kind of practiced ease that made my hands shake even as I tried to pretend I didn't hear the water running or the way his footsteps settled too softly against the tile for someone not trying to be noticed. He brewed coffee like it was any other day, measuring the grounds with quiet care and humming something under his breath that I didn't recognize but hated anyway. Not because of the tune, but because of the calm behind it. And when he slid the cup toward me without asking how I liked it, I didn't reach for it, didn't thank him, didn't even glance in his direction. I just left the room with my spine held straight and my fingers curled into the edge of my robe, like they might split the fabric if I held on tight enough. I locked the bathroom door even though I didn't need to, even though the house was open and quiet. And the only sound was the birds outside and the low hum of the ceiling fan spinning above the sink. And I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my own face as if I could read something in it I hadn't seen before. Some clue about how far things had already gone without permission. The day stretched long and slow, and I did everything I could to avoid him without making it obvious, walking the edge of the pool with a book I never opened, rinsing fruit I didn't eat, carrying my sandals in one hand while I paced the deck for no reason other than to stay in motion. Because I knew if I stopped, even for a moment, I'd start remembering the warmth of his mouth and the shape of silence between our bodies, and the way I hadn't pulled away fast enough. He didn't push. He didn't ask. He didn't even seem to follow me, but he was always there anyway, leaning against the kitchen counter when I refilled my water, sitting near the terrace steps when I stepped outside, his eyes calm but unreadable, like he'd already accepted something I hadn't been willing to name. And that stillness unnerved me more than anything he could have said. That evening, when the sun dipped low behind the water and the trees began to bend toward the dark, I found him near the edge of the property, crouched beside the stone path with his phone pointed toward the horizon, and I thought I could slip past him without a word until he turned and held the screen out to me like an offering, without saying anything at all. I took the phone because I didn't want to pretend I wasn't curious, and the video played quietly in the small frame, the sound of the wind barely audible beneath the recording. And there I was, standing near the old canoe in that light summer dress I had promised myself I wouldn't wear again. My hair lifted by the breeze, the sky behind me orange and lavender like something from a postcard. And the camera lingered just long enough to make the moment feel too real. I gave the phone back without speaking, and walked away before I could ask why he had been filming or how long he'd been watching, or whether he had ever planned to show it to me at all. And I went inside to fold the same towels I had already folded twice that afternoon, my hands moving without thought while my mind spun in slow, unsteady circles. Later that night, the phone rang, and it was Greg, calling from the mainland with the same calm tone he always used when something had worked out easier than expected, and he told me the construction issue had resolved itself faster than he thought, and that he'd be catching an early flight back in 2 days. And I said all the right things in all the right places. But the sound of his voice felt like a deadline being dropped into the middle of a storm. When I hung up, the silence felt too clean, like something had just been erased instead of resolved. And I sat in the kitchen for a long time with the lights off, the glow from the hallway creeping across the floor like it didn't know where to land. And I waited for something to break inside me that never quite did. That was when I heard him walk past my door, not in a hurry and not slow, just walking, the weight of his steps neither heavy nor light. And I stood on the other side of the frame with my hand near the knob and my heart beating too loud in the space between us. And then he stopped, just outside, not knocking, not moving, just standing there for a few seconds longer than he should have. I didn't open the door, and he didn't speak. And after a while, I heard him keep walking, but the air didn't shift back to normal. It just stayed caught in that shape, like the walls had memorized the distance between his body and mine. I stayed in the kitchen long after the footsteps faded, down the hall, and the silence pressed itself tight around my shoulders like a second skin that didn't breathe. And I tried to focus on the sound of the ceiling fan above me, and the distant chirping outside the window, and the slow rhythm of the refrigerator kicking on and off in its usual tired pattern. But all I could hear was the echo of him stopping, near my door, and the heaviness of everything we hadn't said, settling into the corners of the house like it had always belonged there. Didn't want to sleep, and I didn't want to stay in that chair any longer. So I stood up barefoot and walked through the main room without turning on the lights, feeling the wood warm under my soles and the air still holding the trace of the heat we'd carried through the day, and I told myself I needed air. Just a few minutes outside to clear whatever was building inside my chest before it rooted itself too deep to ignore. The sand was cool against my feet as I stepped off the porch and toward the beach, the path lit only by the pale curve of the moon stretched low over the water, and I didn't think about where I was going or whether he might be there already because I didn't plan to find him. I just wanted stillness, something quiet enough to cancel out the noise I had been dragging with me all evening. But he was there. He was sitting alone near the edge of the water with his knees pulled up and his elbows resting across them and his head tilted slightly back, like he had been waiting for the tide to speak first, and he didn't move when he saw me and he didn't smile or stand. He just looked at me as if I were part of the horizon he had already accepted might shift. I thought about turning around and walking back to the villa, like none of it mattered. Like he wasn't there and I wasn't barefoot and the air wasn't thick with whatever we hadn't allowed to happen yet, but I didn't. I walked slowly until I was close enough to hear the sea brushing against the shore in small, uneven waves, and close enough to see that he hadn't blinked once since I arrived. He said my name softly, not as a greeting, but as a fact, as if saying it was a way of placing something back in the world that had slipped from its place. And then he said I wasn't the same person I had been when we first got here, that something in me had changed. And he said it like it wasn't a warning or a compliment, but a truth that had been waiting to be spoken out loud. I didn't respond. Just looked at him with the kind of stillness you use when your body is trying to betray you, and your thoughts have already surrendered. And I felt something inside me shift again, not violently and not suddenly, but in a quiet kind of finality that doesn't ask for permission or offer escape. The wind picked up near the surface of the water and carried the sound of his words back toward me, even though he wasn't speaking anymore. And I felt the hem of my robe pull slightly against my legs, and I let my arms stay loose at my sides, even though every part of me wanted to wrap them across my chest and close something off that had already been left open. I turned and walked away without saying anything, because if I had opened my mouth, then I wouldn't have trusted what might come out. And I needed to keep something for myself in that moment. Something unsaid and untouched and not yet damaged by what might happen next. Back inside, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the hallway for a while with my knees pulled up and my back against the wall just outside the door where he had stood an hour earlier, and I listened to the sound of nothing and tried to measure how far I had moved from who I thought I still was. The light from the bathroom was still on, and I hadn't turned it off when I passed through, and it spilled across the floor, like a line I hadn't meant to draw but now couldn't erase, and I stared at it until my eyes stung and I had to close them, and even then I still saw the shape of his face in the dark. Not smiling, not asking, just waiting. Greg was supposed to return in the morning, and the weight of that certainty settled over the house like an invisible curtain drawn halfway across the room, not heavy enough to suffocate but present enough to shift the shape of everything I did that evening. From the way I folded the extra towels near the bathroom door to how carefully I arranged the glass of water beside my bed, as if preparing for something that might arrive without knocking. I changed into the soft cotton nightgown I had worn on the second night of the trip, the one that no longer smelled like my perfume but still felt familiar against my skin, and I told myself I was going to sleep early not out of avoidance, but because tomorrow would begin earlier than usual, and I needed to feel rested, though somewhere beneath that excuse I could feel the shallow breath of something less honest and more restless. The sheets were cool when I slid beneath them, and I left one foot outside the blanket like I always did when the room was too quiet, listening to the way the ceiling fan ticked once every third rotation, and the night insects buzzed far beyond the mosquito screens, and my thoughts moved in. Slow, heavy circles around the image of Greg stepping through the door with that tired business travel look on his face, and the faint apology in his eyes that usually came before the suitcase hit the floor. Sleep didn't come easily, but it came, and when it did, it arrived without dreams, or maybe with ones so faint I couldn't recall their shapes, only the feeling of having drifted far enough from my body to forget where I was, which is why the touch startled me, not from fear, but from how gentle it was, how unexpected in its familiarity. Fingers traced the edge of my spine through the thin fabric, and warm breath settled just behind my ear in a way that made my shoulders tense before softening involuntarily. And the next thing I registered was the warmth of lips pressing against my neck with a slowness that didn't ask for permission because it already belonged, and I exhaled with a shiver I couldn't control. Not from fear or recognition, but from a memory I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. In the dark, without opening my eyes, I whispered, "You're home," and reached for him with a tenderness I had been holding in reserve since the day we arrived, thinking the early return was his way of closing the distance between us in silence instead of words. And when his hand slid carefully over my ribs and settled at my waist, I let myself lean into it, not just because I believed the touch, but because my body had already begun to answer. There was no talking, no sound beyond breath and the shifting of fabric and the quiet tension that spread between two bodies relearning each other in the dark. and I didn't think about whether he had taken off his shoes or closed the door, or where his suitcase might be, because my thoughts had already turned inward toward the pull of something older than logic, something I had missed more than I had admitted even to myself. His breath slowed as he moved closer, and my fingers found the side of his face, tracing the shape of his jaw before reaching the back of his neck, where the skin was damp and warm, and I felt him kiss my shoulder with a kind of patience that made my chest ache with relief and guilt all at once. And for a moment I thought this was what it meant to be chosen again, to be returned to like a safe place instead of an obligation. And then he whispered my name. The moment his voice reached me, low and almost careful, the syllables of my name stretched just enough to sound foreign in his mouth. I felt a crack split through the warmth I had been wrapped in, not wide or violent, but deep enough that everything inside me shifted before I could stop it, and I opened my eyes into a darkness that suddenly felt too full. For a second, maybe less, I thought it had just been the way he said it, the sleep still thick in my ears, distorting the tone, but the quiet that followed carried something unfamiliar, and my hand, still resting against his neck, found no wedding band where it should have been, only smooth skin and a pulse that didn't match what I had known for the last 2 decades. My heart stuttered in a rhythm I couldn't control as I turned slightly, slowly, not in panic, but with a kind of silent dread that comes only when the truth is already seated in the room and all that's left is to face it. And his face, so close, barely visible in the dark, came into focus not with the features of the man I had loved, but with the unmistakable shape of Jacob's silence. He didn't move when I pulled back slightly, didn't flinch or apologize or even blink. He just looked at me as if the moment had always belonged to him, as if he had waited for it to unfold exactly like this. And I couldn't decide what unsettled me more, the fact that he had crossed the line or that I hadn't stopped him when I still had the chance. I wanted to say something, anything, a question or a command or even his name, but nothing came, because my throat was tight and my breath had already betrayed me, and the warmth from my own body pressed into the sheets like evidence I couldn't erase, and my muscles, instead of stiffening, had begun to soften again, as if memory and confusion had started rewriting the rules. I thought of Greg and the sound of his voice over the phone, how steady it had been when he said, "I'll be home soon." And I imagined him walking through the door tomorrow, tired and smiling and trusting, and I couldn't understand how the part of me that should have been screaming was now quiet. How the boundaries I believed would hold had already crumbled beneath nothing more than a breath and a hand and a name spoken in the wrong voice. My body had gone still but not cold, and I hated how the moment didn't end in rupture or recoil, but in stillness, in the unbearable ache of recognition, because the desire that pulsed beneath the shame hadn't come from nowhere. It had grown over days of silence and glances and closeness that I had allowed to breathe. And now that it was real, it didn't feel like something I could deny, only something I could no longer pretend to misunderstand. He leaned back slightly, giving me space without leaving, and for a long stretch neither of us spoke. The silence between us, broken only by the faint ticking of the ceiling fan and the wind outside brushing against the shutters. And even though my hands had returned to my own side and the blankets pulled back over my chest, the weight of his presence stayed in the room like a second heartbeat. When I finally closed my eyes again, it wasn't out of sleep, but out of retreat. As if darkness might undo what had just happened or dull it into a shape I could hold without falling apart. But there was no forgetting the sound of my own voice saying, "You're home," when it wasn't Greg beside me, and no comfort in the way the sheets still smelled like salt and heat and confusion. By the time the first light crept through the blinds and painted a thin line across the wall, he was already gone, the room cold where he had been lying, the air cleared of breath and warmth, and the house so quiet I could almost believe I had dreamt it, if not for the crease in the pillow beside mine and the outline of his movement still carved faintly into the fabric. I sat up slowly, my hands curled in the sheets like I might wring the night out of them, and I looked at the door, still closed, still quiet, still bearing no witness to what had slipped through it in the dark, and I felt no pain, no panic, no anger, only the slow, hollow awareness that something had passed through me without permission and left me not broken, but unguarded, and that somehow was worse. He came back earlier than expected without warning and without the usual hum of suitcase wheels across the walkway, or the sound of his voice calling my name in that half-relieved tone he always used when returning from long trips, and instead walked through the front door as if it were just another quiet morning in a quiet house, as if nothing had shifted while he was away. And the only sign that anything was different was the way he kissed my cheek without looking me in the eyes and then turned toward the lagoon like he had been staring at it all the way from the airport. Followed him to the kitchen where he poured himself a glass of water without asking if I wanted anything, and leaned against the counter with the glass resting loosely in his fingers, while his gaze stayed locked on the view beyond the windows, where the light hit the water in a way that should have felt calm but didn't, and when he finally spoke his voice was low and deliberate and quieter than it needed to be, which made it land harder than if he'd shouted. He said, "Have you even looked at me this morning, Carolyn? Or are you still staring at the place where someone else held you last night?" And I felt the words like a slap across the back of my neck, not because they were loud or cruel, but because they were so exact, so direct, that there was no space left for pretending I didn't understand what he meant. I didn't answer because I didn't know what he had seen, or how much he knew, or whether this was just a suspicion built out of silence and distance and all the small hesitations that had grown between us over the years like moss on the underside of our marriage. But then he set the glass down with a sharp click and pulled out his phone with the kind of controlled movement that always meant he wasn't angry yet. Just done. He didn't unlock it immediately, just held it up so I could see the screen already. Open to a photo posted hours earlier from the beach club, an aerial shot of the shoreline lit with fire pits and paper lanterns where couples danced and drinks blurred into hands. And in the background near the edge of the frame, just out of focus but still unmistakably clear, was me standing too close to Jacob, the side of my body arched slightly into his, the curve of his arm around my waist, and both our faces tilted, inward in a way that left no doubt about what had happened in the seconds before or after the shutter clicked. Stared at the photo longer than I should have, because some part of me still wanted to find a way to explain it, or deny it, or pretend it had been misread. But there was nothing to say when a moment had been captured so carelessly, and yet so accurately. And when I finally lifted my eyes to meet his, I saw that he wasn't holding the phone anymore, just looking at me like I had confirmed something he had hoped wasn't true. Then he said, still not raising his voice, "At first I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the way the shadows fell or a bad angle. But then the receptionist called and asked politely if whoever was staying in our villa could keep the noise down next time, because guests had complained about voices carrying too loud through the patio after midnight, and I couldn't tell if the shaking I felt came from my hands or the air between us tightening by the second. I stayed silent because every version of the truth I could have offered would have sounded thinner than the one already written across the screen, and part of me knew that the real damage wasn't in the kiss itself or even the night that followed, but in how easily I had let it happen, how quickly I had stepped into something I told myself I didn't want. He watched me for another breath, and then nodded like he had just made peace with something ugly, and without another word he turned and walked out to the terrace with the kind of steady rhythm that doesn't belong to someone angry, but to someone finished. He came back into the room a few minutes later carrying my suitcase, the one I hadn't touched since we arrived, the one still half-zipped with sandals tucked beneath rolled blouses and sunscreen wedged beside an unread paperback, and he placed it near the door without looking at me like someone returning a borrowed item that didn't belong anymore. And he stood beside it for a moment before saying in the same calm voice that somehow landed harder than yelling ever could, "You don't live here anymore, not in this house and not with me. You go back alone. I opened my mouth to speak because something in me still thought I could rewind it all to the moment before that kiss, the moment before the air between us started to shift. But nothing came out because the words that lived in me weren't the kind that fixed anything. And he didn't wait for an explanation, because explanations are for people who believe they were misunderstood. I stepped toward him without meaning to, my voice finally returning in something hoarse and broken, and I said it was a mistake, that it had meant nothing, that it never should have happened, and that I didn't recognize myself in what I had done. But he shook his head slowly, like someone hearing something they've heard too many times before, and said, "No, Carolyn, the mistake wasn't that night. The mistake was me believing you were still mine when you'd already stopped being that a long time ago." His words didn't rise in volume, but they rose in weight, pressing into my chest in a way that made breathing feel like a task instead of a reflex. And I tried again to reach him, to explain that it wasn't about Jacob or youth or attention, that it was about something I couldn't name, something that had crept in slowly over years of silence and absence, and evenings passed without touch. But he held up one hand, not in anger but in finality, and said, "I don't need the reason, because I already lived through the result." I told him I didn't want to go, that I wanted to fix it, that I hadn't known how far I had drifted until it was too late. And I started crying, not because I wanted to manipulate the moment, but because I finally understood that there were no pieces to pick up, only what had been swept aside too many times until it became something neither of us recognized. He didn't step forward or soften or reach out like he used to when we fought over smaller things. When dinner had gone cold, or I forgot his flight time, or we passed each other in the kitchen without speaking for hours, instead he just looked at me like I was a door he'd already closed and said, "What hurts isn't what you did. What hurts is that I let you become the kind of person who could." There was nothing left after that. He didn't offer me a ride or ask if I needed help or wonder where I would go or who I would call. He just turned away and walked out onto the terrace with the same steady pace he'd carried since morning, and I stood there for a long time not knowing whether to unzip the suitcase or burn it where it stood, because either way, I didn't feel like I had a right to touch anything inside it anymore. Eventually, I stepped outside where the dock stretched into the lagoon like a line I wasn't sure I was allowed to cross, and someone from the staff had already prepared the small boat that would take me back to the main island, and I didn't ask who told them or when because the answer didn't matter anymore. And I climbed in with my hands wrapped around the straps of the bag like they could hold me up if the boat shifted too hard. As the motor hummed to life and the water parted beneath the hull, I turned just once to look back at the villa. And he was still standing at the end of the dock, not waving, not moving, not even blinking, just watching, or maybe not watching at all. And on his face there was no fury, no heartbreak, no trace of love or memory or forgiveness, just stillness, heavy, and complete like a stone that had decided never to move again. And in that moment I knew that I wasn't being left behind.